Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to this evening's live stream presentation. My name is John. I am the Tattooed Historian, and it's great to be back on here, seeing you all in the comments section popping up, and to once again see my great friend Pete Carmichael, director of the Civil War Institute at Gettysburg College. Good evening, Pete.
Hello, John. John and I are both a little weary from our Saturday extravaganza. We had 2 interviews in the morning, and then we had our 2.5 hour to 3 hour battlefield tour. All of it was really good. It was, Michael, kind of a salute to the CWI conference, which would have been, well, it would have been ongoing. Tonight would have been the end of the first day of tours, and then tomorrow would have been the last. So Michael is a veteran at CWI. I believe you were at CWI last summer on a panel on the political crisis of the 1850s, I believe.
That's right.
And Rachel Sheldon was on that. Michael Berkner of Gettysburg. And I am Nicole from Ball State University. Oh my gosh, Nicole's last name is?
Etchison,
that's right. She was on an excellent panel. Michael, we're thrilled to have you here this evening to talk about your new book, Arguing Until Doomsday. Michael, I believe I told you this by email. UNC books receive a 40% discount for our viewers. The press has been kind enough, and John has just put it up, the discount code, which is just below us. So for those of you who are interested in Michael's book, I can tell you, Amazon can't beat this price. And so there it is, and we'll put this back up as well. I want to say a little bit about Michael, who was at Marshall University for really your entire career until this year, when Michael has received, or I should say accepted, a position at the University of Tennessee. He'll be in the faculty history department as an associate professor. But his, I don't want to say main line of work, but certainly an important duty is the editorship of the Andrew Jackson papers. And so before we talk about that, because I want to ask Michael about the Andrew Jackson papers, I just want to say that I feel old saying this, and I've known Michael for a while, but I see Michael as a generation of historians just below me, I guess. And Michael's work, it is always grounded in original research. He is a person that gets out there into the archives. His methodology that he employs, as I think always creative, he works in material culture. He also does the history of emotions. And in fact, his first book, Emotional and Sexual Conflicts in the Antebellum United States, and published by Cambridge. I'm sorry I don't have a copy of it right at my disposal. I believe that's right upstairs. I'll say it again. Emotional and Sexual Conflict in the Antebellum United States. Again, it brings that dimension. Michael, we've talked a little bit about this with our audiences, that dimension of emotions or emotives, and how that world, when it is not fully considered, it sort of reduces people, I believe, to people who are just concerned about power for power's sake. And that's a pretty impoverished view, I think, of how anyone, but especially historical actors, how they behave. It's an outstanding book, and it is one that was done under the guidance of Mark Smith. We've mentioned Mark Smith at the University of South Carolina. We had, I believe, Evan Kutzler was he at grad school at the same time you were?
Yeah, we overlapped for a few years.
Yeah. So Evan was on the show as well, both trained by Mark Smith. And again, Mark noted for doing sensory history and emotional history as well. Michael's done a range of other things, and I won't go through his very long resume, but I do want to mention it's a fantastic piece entitled Tracing the Sacred Relics, the Strange Career of Preston Brooks's Cane. Right? It's a fascinating story. And Michael, of course, not being the diligent historian that you are, I do not have the citation quick at hand. And that, where could someone find that? What journal?
Civil War History in June 2017.
Look at that, right? And a special issue devoted to what academics call material culture, what I think the public would say are relics or artifacts, right?
Mm-hmm.
So it's a journal well worth perusing. Michael's article, Tracing the Sacred Relics, The Strange Career of the Cane of Preston Brooks. Do we know where the cane really is? Are you convinced we know where it is? What do you think, Michael? Where is it?
We know that it's probably at the Old State House Museum in Boston.
In Boston? What? It should be in South Carolina, shouldn't it?
Well, there's pieces of it in South Carolina, in the South Carolina State Museum. Fragments that were fashioned into jewelry and given as gifts shortly after the incident in 1856. But kind of a strange turn of events. Took the main piece of the cane, handed down through a few generations of Henry Wise's family, who's probably best known for being the governor of Virginia, who oversaw the hanging of John Brown, and then in the 1920s ended up in Boston. It's interesting, Pete, that you said it should be in South Carolina, because what we remember is the caning of Charles Sumner, right? Not the caning by Preston Brooks. So I suppose one could make the argument that Massachusetts is the
right
resting place. Yeah.
Michael, one other point about the article I found fascinating. We looked at the petty partisanship and bickering. It's always been part of our system, but for whatever reason, people think it's more acute now than ever before. But I was struck by the debates over not the composition of the cane, I guess, or what the cane was made over, and why were people fighting about that? Would you mind telling folks about that? I think it's fascinating.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, there was a whole congressional investigation into the densities and the weights and the resilience of different kinds of canes, whether they were made of wood or in the case of the cane that Preston Brooks used in the attack on Charles Sumner, gutta percha, which is extracted from kind of a sap-like substance from a tree. And I think what was at stake there, in some sense, is just how much danger was Charles Sumner actually in. How flimsy was this weapon, or how dangerous was it? And I mean, there was a physician who testified and said, look, if you hit someone in the head with any kind of a cane enough times, it's going to be dangerous at a certain point. So the debate probably went a little bit more into depth than it needed to.
I guess the Southern response was that gutta percha was a soft material, and that Sumner just had a feeble cranium, right?
Right, or that he was faking of his injuries. I mean, he stayed out of the Senate for 3 years after the fact, and so there were some who claimed that he was
just calling in sick, right? Just to get a few days off, and it turned out to be 3 years. Right before he knew it, 3 years were gone. One of my friends, Keith Bohannon, who Michael knows and John knows as well, who's up in at CWI. He met one of Preston Brooks's descendants, and I believe maybe in Tennessee, I'm not sure where, but she had a number of the canes that Preston Brooks's admirers sent, right? And she had a number of them, and she took one, according to Keith, and tapped herself on the head, and said, "See, this doesn't hurt anyone."
Wow.
Wonderful story. I don't know what anyone can make anything of it or not. So again, I just want to say the kind of work that Michael does, it's always worth reading. It's always very thoughtful. And he did another piece, and I think this is going to lead us into our conversation about his book today. It's a piece that he did for the blog that accompanies the Society of Civil War Historians, again, an organization that John and I have mentioned a number of times. If you go to the blog, which does have a name, and I don't remember, it's not the Courier. Do you know what the name of the blog is?
Muster.
The Muster. That is it. The Muster. Right. And I think this piece that Michael did on the mudsills, that idea, I think our audience, one needs to know what is meant by calling someone a mudsill. How did it originate? And then how did that word, in a sense, function, right? As a political weapon. It's weaponized, right? Southerners try to weaponize it, and then Northerners do as well. And I think because language is really important here when we try to understand politics. So could you tell us a little bit about that? And again, for those of you who are listening, go to the muster, right?
Mm-hmm.
So type in the muster, type in Michael Woods, and you'll see the entire piece. But Michael's going to tell us a little bit about mudsills, right? And then we'll slide into a discussion of his book.
Yeah, so the term gets popularized in a speech given in the Senate by James Henry Hammond, who was a South Carolina senator in 1858, who opined that every society needs a class of people who do menial labor, people who work with their hands. And he called these folks mudsills. And he said, in the South, we have enslaved this class or this sort of level of society, and that's given us order and stability. And in the North, you have this class too, but you've made the great mistake of allowing these folks to vote, giving them too much power, and hence your society is disorderly and prone to collapse. The mudsill speech became overnight news across the free states. I mean, you have people organizing mudsill clubs, and a lot of working people in the North. Obviously, they're outraged by this, to be sort of written off as this degraded level of society. But they also kind of reclaim the term and turn it into a badge of honor. That we're people with the know-how and the skill. And our labor makes the economy function, and so it becomes weaponized. I think is a good term when the Civil War begins a few years later, and you see appeals to mudsills used in Union recruiting literature. You see it used in Republican campaign literature. The Lincoln campaign uses this in 1860. And so it takes on a kind of a life of its own. And one of the things that a lot of people recognized at the time was that this was something that would get white Northerners who may not care very much about enslaved people in the South. This would give them a sense that, that Southern aristocracy, what they would call the slave power, really didn't like them. Really didn't respect them, really kind of wanted to lord it over the whole country, and it would give them a sense of having something at stake in the fight, that the dignity of labor and of free labor was essential. So if you look at this term, it shows up in soldiers' diaries. They'll celebrate victories. They'll say, "Oh, the mudsills of the North just beat the chivalry of the South."
Yeah.
And then it comes up big time in 1865 when Sherman is moving through South Carolina, and his soldiers just start torching all of the big homes that they can find, because, as they said, they've been waiting for revenge on South Carolina in particular. Yeah. And that mudsill speech has a lot to do with it.
Resonated with them. Yeah. When I was a reenactor back in the day in Indiana, the organization that I belonged to, was a hodgepodge of various union groups. We were called the Mudsills. Mm-hmm. Again, we didn't know any of that context, right? And I think that's especially important for the war years. Mm-hmm. As you just pointed out, Sherman's men increasingly came to see that the system of slavery, that it's what they believe was that the real victim was the poor white. That's what they believed, right? Mm-hmm. And you can see how that what slavery, if expanded into the territories, what that could do for other white men, and how that could relegate them in society, which we're going to get to. I want to get to one other point about that article, Michael, that I thought you did it. I thought it was an apt comparison. You made an analogy to Trump's election and against Hillary Clinton, and could you just talk a little bit, just briefly, about that, how that connects to mudsill?
I don't. You're going to have to jog my memory on that one, Pete.
So what did Hillary Clinton call Trump supporters? What did she call them?
Oh, well, she used the term deplorables.
Deplorables, right there. And in
Yeah.
your piece, you make the point, right? How that word, how it came to be what? It became a rallying cry for many of Trump's supporters and was certainly more than dismissive, in which I suspect that she immediately wanted those that words back, right, when she said it. But as we can see, right, it became something that helped unify people who supported Trump and helped identify them as, I would say, we are not part of that elite class, that political class that supports or that supported Hillary Clinton. I bring that up because, one, I think that 19th century historians, really like all historians, they very much want to be relevant. They want to connect to contemporary issues. And I've seen time and time again the attempt to do so. It is such a stretch and such a strain that it often removes us from the history itself. And we lose sight of what is one of the many gifts that I think the craft of history brings to the public. That's the importance of context, right? Being time and place specific. Mm-hmm. And so this stretching, this reaching, this almost desperation to be relevant, I think it doesn't do a great deal of service, not just for our profession, but for the people who we want to give them an opportunity to think, more deeply in more complex terms. I think that quick analogy that you made and that you forgot, but I thought it was a really good one, right? Because you weren't leveling any value judgments at all, right? You were making an important comparison. I think there's parallels between the past and today. I don't know how you or John feel about whether the history recycles itself or that somehow, some way that we sort of can see the future if we know the past. I don't believe in any of that. Now, people do, and that's, of course, their business. But I really like that piece. I like how you made history relevant, and you did so without abandoning what Metzos was about, how it was used politically by Southerners and by Northerners as well. All right. So let's now turn to the book. John, would you like to get us started? Or I'm happy to get us go out of the gate here, whatever you like.
Well, I'd like to pose a question, Michael, if you would, that's really one that we get in every single series, it seems like, from the people in the comments section who watch us weekly. And they always want to know two things, which is why the antebellum period in this case? Why was this the direction you wanted to go with your work? And second, what kind of a research method did you use to utilize your work in this book?
Mm-hmm. I don't really remember a time when I wasn't interested in the antebellum period. Mm-hmm. So, I mean, in some ways, this book is an outgrowth of the research that I did for my first book. There were things that I found in the archives that intrigued me and that I didn't think could be explained by other work that I had read. And I can go into more detail on that if you like. But so that it's sort of, there's a trajectory to the work that I've done where they connect to each other. As far as research method, I mean, the important thing for me, and Pete alluded to this, was to dig into the archives and especially into constituent correspondence, which I think is invaluable for understanding politics, because it tells you, and especially in this period where there's no public opinion polls, there's no kind of instant way to gauge public sentiment. Those kinds of reports coming in from back home to major politicians like Stephen Douglas and Jefferson Davis are invaluable. And so fortunately, both of these men left vast collections of manuscript material. It took me 7 weeks to read through Douglas's correspondence at the University of Chicago. Davis's papers are a bit more scattered, but there's rich collections in several different archives. And so that was really at the heart of it, was understanding what did they know about how their actions were being received by constituents, and then how did their constituents and the folks back in their home states of Illinois and Mississippi, how did they evaluate? How did they see these two figures, and how did their pressure help to ultimately to drive them apart and to splinter their party. So it's definitely rooted in the archives and in some really rich material that probably hasn't, especially for Douglas, hasn't gotten as much attention as it deserves.
You know, Michael, I was somewhat embarrassed as I was, reading your book, and I thought to myself, why is it that I've always thought of almost all antebellum politicians is essentially disconnected from their constituents? Why didn't I ever think about the fact that people are writing them and pressuring them and making demands upon them at the local and at the state level, right? That it mattered, right? And the decisions that they're making in Congress, well, of course, it's a reflection of the people back home. I can't get my students to understand when they denounce the political class that we have today, that political class is a reflection of them. And I have students, again, I'm not trying to be political one way or the other. I'm just stating a fact. Students will say to me, how is it that certain members of the Republican Party continue to abide by Trump when he's done this, this, and this? And I say to them, because the people in their constituency, in their district, or in their state are Trump supporters, right? You can't expect a politician to jump off the ship, right, when he's got those people who are behind him. So we're going to get back to that. Michael, I think one thing for our viewers that would be helpful, and you don't need to go into great detail here, but could you broadly frame some of the theories about the coming of the Civil War? I'd like to understand that briefly. And then I'd like for you to situate your book, situate that within these broad theories or approaches to understanding the coming of the war.
Mm-hmm. I mean, there's a pretty fundamental split between the so-called fundamentalists who would argue that there's just these deep-rooted social, political, economic distinctions between two societies in the United States that go to war. And in that case, maybe something about the timing of the war might be up for kind of a bit of contingency, but that basically this war was going to happen in some form. And then you have those who emphasize contingency, who argue that this is a product of human decisions or human foibles, that none of this was foreordained in any way, and that if we really dig in and look at how people make decisions, how they think about things, the accidents of history, that things could have been really different in a really basic way. In some sense, I've always been, and this goes back to my first book, I've been trying to reconcile those, or maybe not to completely bridge the gap between them, but to try to draw insights from both. And so I probably lean a bit more toward the fundamental side. But I think that one of the advantages of a book like Arguing Until Doomsday is that biographical, or in this case, a dual biographical approach, really lets us understand how real people lived and navigated this increasingly divided and, for both of them, often very frightening political landscape. And so it isn't that they were that they were members of a generation that blundered its way into war. And I mean, one of the points of the book is that we can't understand either one without situating them in their home states and in what's happening there. But they still made decisions. They still made mistakes. They still misunderstood certain things. And so I suppose it would be ultimately an effort to humanize that kind of fundamental view of the coming of the war by looking at how two actual people saw things.
And two actual people who were very prominent in the Democratic Party.
Yeah.
Well, let's do a little background again, and then we'll start to get into like the nature of your argument. I think, again, Michael, I don't know if you'd agree with me about this, and John, but it strikes me at the college level when the Civil War is taught that too often we skim the politics of the 1850s, for a variety of reasons, but it doesn't receive maybe the attention that it deserves. So can you give us very quickly we get to the Kansas-Nebraska Act of 1854. We don't need to know the background of that act, but we need to know what it did to the two-party system and what came out of it and why the Democratic Party, right, a national party, it persevered. So could you help our audience understand that?
Mm-hmm. Sure. So the Kansas-Nebraska Act, 1854, is a hugely important milestone. I mean, I tell my students it's one of the most important pieces of legislation in the history of the United States. It opens two new territories of Kansas and Nebraska, which are much larger than the modern day states. I mean, it's basically the northern 2/3 of the Great Plains are encompassed here. These are areas that had been closed to the possibility of slavery expansion since 1820, but now it is possible thanks to the policy of popular sovereignty by which voters in each of these territories in some way, and that's kind of the crux of the debate, will have the opportunity to weigh in on whether slavery will be illegal there or not. It's passed as a Democratic Party measure. Stephen Douglas is a real kind of force behind the passage of the legislation. President Franklin Pierce made it somewhat reluctantly, but made it a party measure, and it proves profoundly disruptive in a couple of ways. It's this law that really brings the Republican Party into being. I mean, it is essentially born as a response to the Kansas-Nebraska Act, and this is the party that will call for free soil in all Western territories and say there will be an end to slavery expansion. And of course, it's the victory of that party in 1860 that's the kind of immediate trigger for secession. But it's also profoundly disruptive within the Democratic Party. And that is because there is a very, very deep-rooted difference between predominantly, although not entirely, a northern wing of the party and a predominantly southern wing of the party about what exactly popular sovereignty means, how it should work, and really what the extent of popular majority control ought to be over slavery status in the territories. And that is a dispute that I think gets glossed over, not just in history textbooks, but in a lot of deeper studies of the coming of the war. And so bringing that to the forefront, I think, is the only way to explain what happened to the Democratic Party in 1860, which is it fragments and they run two competing candidates, one of whom was Douglas. And essentially, you see the last national political party fracture in those 6 years between 1854 and 1860. That's really the heart of the book.
It is, although there's some important background here, and then I'll ask my question here, and then we'll throw it over to John. Let's talk about Davis and about Douglas. And I just want to say that what makes this such a fascinating book is that it is a dual biography. It's not a traditional biography in any way. And what you do so well is that you situate both of these men from their journeys, one to Illinois, of course, and the other to Mississippi. Could you talk to us about those experiences and how it shaped, this is the critical part, how it shaped their visions of the West and manifest destiny? I think that's really critical.
It is. So they both are born further east than they end up. I mean, Davis is born in Kentucky. Douglas is born in Vermont. They both moved west and made their careers in the Mississippi River Valley, which is a hugely important real geographic space, but also important in the way that a lot of antebellum Americans envisioned the country, that this is kind of the heart of what will become a continent-wide republic. And so they both are, I think, deeply shaped by very formative experiences in two states that are in the same river valley. And so Douglas really embraces a kind of a booster view of the West, that it'll be driven by railroads and urban development and crops like wheat and lumber, and that if you kind of give people a stable set of political institutions and you build a bunch of infrastructure and you can just kind of stand back and allow this kind of empire to grow. And so I see him as trying to extend what I call in the book the Greater Northwest, with Chicago really as its kind of commercial capital, all the way to the Pacific Ocean. I come from the Pacific Northwest, so perhaps I'm more attuned to Douglas's thinking about this, but he's really focused on kind of this Great Lakes to Puget Sound kind of region. It's very near and dear to him. This would be a very decentralized kind of place. You'd have a series of kind of self-governing states and territories, essentially. You kind of just turn folks loose in these areas. Davis has a different vision. He's equally committed to westward expansion as Douglas is, and there are certainly moments where they align very closely. They both are eager supporters of the annexation of Texas, eager supporters of the war with Mexico. So they aren't arguing all the time, but they argue an awful lot of the time. And one of the things where they just fundamentally disagree is on how are you going to combine expansion with the fact that you already are having these disputes about slavery. And what Douglas envisions is ultimately a much more centralized kind of expansion, where federal power, the courts, military, law enforcement, will support the property rights of slaveholders throughout the West, potentially in any territory. And that's given some judicial weight with the Dred Scott decision in 1857, which is in the short run a major victory for Davis's vision of what the West should look like. And so he's envisioning slave labor being exploited in California, in gold mines, in irrigated agriculture. He's envisioning this happening in New Mexico. And crucially, he's hearing from people on the ground who share that vision, who say, yeah, this is possible. There's not a natural limit to where slavery could go. If it's supported and protected, then there's really no limit to this. And so that's the vision that he has. And it's fundamentally at odds with what Douglas is trying to do.
Yeah. I think your chapter title is it Manifest Destinies? Plural?
Yeah.
So,
yeah.
Absolutely. Different views.
Nice.
Just real quickly about Douglas. I could see someone reading this book or just hearing you now and making the conclusion that though Douglas is a Democrat, he was reflective of this conviction amongst Northerners that government at the federal level should have a decisive role in the lives of the people, that government, not necessarily more centralized, because as you point out, he still believed that the people on the ground in the territories, that they could make their way in this world, including deciding on their political institutions. But nonetheless, there is still a desire for federal support, extensive federal support for harbors, for railroads, for all the kinds of things, as you pointed out, Michael, to build that infrastructure. Is someone's interpretation, the one that I just gave you, is that misguided? Is that off the mark? You see my point, right?
I do.
Right? It's the Northerners who wanted the big government, and it's the Southerners who wanted small government, and there's where the rub was. How would you respond to that?
I would say they wanted government to do different things. Davis is a sharp critic of the kind of infrastructure program that Douglas is promoting for, as you mentioned, harbor improvements, building railroads, building canals, supporting these things. He's a sharp critic of that, but at the same time, he wants a vigorous use of federal power to protect slavery everywhere that it exists or might exist. Douglas is much more comfortable with the infrastructure, and he says, no, there's limits to how much we're going to nationally support, the property rights of a slaveholder in New Mexico territory or in Kansas territory. So they both are interested in controlling the levers of federal power, but they want to use it in very different ways. One of the interesting things too about Douglas is how much of that famous Republican Party economic program that we see enacted during the war, how much of that Douglas actually supported. And that was one of the things that surprised me as I was researching this project. The one that he wouldn't embrace was an increased tariff. But beyond that, infrastructure, support for higher education, he actually voted for a failed attempt at what would become the Land Grant Colleges Act in 1859. And so there's a variety of programs that he had been supporting, could never make them Democratic Party measures because the Southern wing of the party wouldn't go along with it. And then the Republicans kind of take that and embrace it and make it their own, as historians have shown.
Michael, with in the antebellum period, for me personally and for others, from a popular history standpoint, or even from an academic standpoint, it seems like after the Lincoln-Douglas debates, Douglas kind of drops off from the picture in the narrative. Did Douglas rise in political power after that? Stay the same? Is he changed by that moment politically at all?
Douglas became very embattled, even more so after the debates with Lincoln in 1858. So, I mean, in the short run, he won re-election. I mean, that was obviously the big thing for him, was he was reelected to the Senate. But he comes under increasing attack in a variety of ways by Southerners within his own party, some of whom had actually hoped that Lincoln would beat him just because they hated him that much and wanted to kind of decapitate him from the party's leadership. And John Slidell of Louisiana is out campaigning for Lincoln, and people are saying Lincoln will win, and he says, "Yeah, but it's worth it to give it Douglas." So he comes under attack. I mean, in early 1859, there's rumors that people are Southerners in the Senate are trying to provoke him into a duel, whereby he could be killed because he has no experience with this, and so they'll get a kind of a crack shot to take him out in a duel. There are
Michael, Douglas is so small; he's not much of a target.
No,
he was short, but a wide target.
He was wide. You're right. Yeah, sorry about that.
He also, they strip him of his chairmanship of the Committee on Territories in the Senate, which was a real sort of basis for a lot of his power. He'd held that chairmanship for his entire time in the Senate up till that point. So he's increasingly embattled. He's writing a lot, which is always dangerous for an antebellum politician. The more letters and articles that you write, the more people you might alienate. But he can't help it. He's too much of a fighter not to. So he's increasingly defensive in 1859 and in 60, and then by the time he wins the party nomination for the presidency in 1860, it's at the cost of fracturing the party, because much of the Southern wing and some of the Northern elements of the party just won't support him, and they support Breckinridge as an alternative. So he certainly hasn't lost any of his visibility politically, but his power within his party is clearly weakened, and his ability to kind of command anything as a party measure is pretty much gone at that point.
Michael, it's utterly mystifying to me that the Democratic Party couldn't get its act together, especially after the election of 1856, when Fremont has a very strong showing, and you probably know off the top of your head, but Republicans take a fair number of seats. I don't remember how many, but it's certainly pretty impressive for their first run.
Mm-hmm.
So, there's already the specter of a Republican Party that is going to become a dominating force at the federal level. And then John Brown's raid. For God's sake, couldn't they say, we have an option here. It is us or the Republicans. And we know that they continue to describe, condemn the Republicans as the Black Republicans. And again, for our audience, that is suggesting that any Republican was an abolitionist in disguise. So could you help us understand, because one of the big points about your book, and it's an important one, that if we are to understand why the war came, why secession, that we must grapple with the unraveling of the Democratic Party.
Mm-hmm.
Which I can say. I mean, I mention it, but I don't think about it, I think, with any real seriousness until I read your book. Mm-hmm. So what's going on here, man? Their political life is at stake. Obviously, the unity of the nation as well, and they can't seem to get it together. Why?
There's a lot of big egos with long memories in the picture, is what I would say. I mean, one of the points I make is that the roots of this division go way back into the early 1840s when Davis and Douglas are first starting out their national careers. So they have been sparring pretty seriously over a lot of these issues for a long time, and they remember that. And there's a lot of bitterness that builds up over the years. Another thing that's going on is both factions of the party are saying we are the only ones who can actually beat the Republicans, so you have to rally around us. But there's also an increasing willingness to accept defeat at the polls as a means potentially of getting something else. So what you see among some, and this is not true of all, it's not true of Davis, for example, but there are elements of the Southern Democratic Party who actually are fine with splitting the party, because if a Republican wins, then they can push for secession, which they've been wanting to do for a long time. So this is people like Yancey, William Barnes Yancey of Alabama would be an example of this. Rhett in South Carolina would be an example of this. They're kind of Democrats, but they're secessionists is what they're at. So fracturing the party for them actually makes good strategic sense. Davis is uncomfortable with this, but they're there. On the other hand, the thing that I really noticed in a lot of the constituent letters to Douglas is an increasing willingness among Northern Democrats to say, we either want Douglas as our standard bearer in the election, and we hope he wins, we'll vote for him, we'll campaign for him. But if he doesn't, we'd rather see a Republican win than a Southern-backed Democrat. They're the ones who are so worried about all these abolitionists. They're the ones who feel like they have a lot to lose. So if they're going to try to tell us who the nominee should be, forget it. Let them, sort of stew under Republican presidency for 4 years. Yeah. So these folks clearly didn't think that secession was necessarily going to be automatic if a Republican won. But there's enough hostility within the party that they're actually willing to court defeat rather than give in to the other faction.
I'm going to follow this with another question, and that is, we hear so often about the power of white supremacy, and I think, again, this does have relevance to today, because I think that what you've done in this book is you have forced us to think behind that banner of white supremacy, to see complexities in how power relations are formed and how power is exerted. And so now my point or question. When we think of the Democratic Party, especially after 1856, we think of a party that is united around the flag of, it's a party for white men. It's a party for white men, and when one looks to the West and to those territories, that even though Southern slaveholders want to bring their institution to those lands, it's nonetheless Douglas's battle cry as well. This is land for white folks, white people. And I guess, again, what I want you to help us all understand, how is it possible that white solidarity, which we again hear time and time again today, not just about what's been going on in the last 21 days since the murder of George Floyd, but that we hear time and time again, as we should look to our past, there is a singular fact, a truism, or one might even say a theme, and it is, again, white supremacy. So if it's so powerful, it's so strong, such a cohesive force, why didn't it hold the Democratic Party together? What's going on?
Right. I mean, one of the points in my book is both Davis and Douglas are deeply racist, and there's no arguing with that.
Right.
But they agree that the country should be governed for and by white men, but that doesn't mean they agree on how those white men should rule or what policies they should promote. Racists don't always agree with each other on everything.
Or yes, or even which white men are entitled to rule.
Yeah, or what the extent of their rule should be. I mean, what it comes down to is a majority of white men going to rule, or are the property rights of a certain class of white men going to be sacrosanct and above all suspicion, all taint, all restriction. And that's really the rub of the argument between them. And so there are moments where you can see them kind of briefly rally, briefly regroup against abolitionists, for example, or against anyone who would dare say that the Declaration of Independence applied to everybody as opposed to just white folks. And so it's there, but it isn't as though these folks suddenly became less racist in 1860, and that's why the party fell apart. It's just that there's other interests at stake here, and they can't use that as a kind of a veil to hide their very real differences over policy forever. I mean, the historian Barbara Fields once pointed out that white supremacy is a slogan, right? Not a sort of single belief system. And I think you see that playing out in what's happening in Davis and Douglas's party, which is that the slogans, the scare tactics, they don't work forever once they actually have to govern. They can be useful sometimes for winning elections, but when they have to make policy decisions, suddenly those differences, which have been festering for many years, just burst forth, and they don't hold together anymore.
Yeah, Michael, we've mentioned Barbara Fields' piece a number of times on this show, and Races and Ideologies in the book that is part of the tribute to C. Vann Woodward, which is a very difficult article to read. I've just been looking at the last few days, and then she did a similar piece that's a little bit more accessible in the New Left Review. But even that has its places where it's really challenging, and all that is so unfortunate, because what you just said, I think, is something that we all could stand a dose of, and trying to understand the issues that are confronting African Americans, particularly those who live in, I'd say, is underserved neighborhoods. I mean, one of the other things that Barbara Fields points out, that this idea that these issues or these problems are racial problems, how much that absolutely disguises. And I think that what you've just said about the Democratic Party and the very fact that so-called racial solidarity that we've always sort of slapped across the party as this is the slogan to enable them to mobilize people to vote in a uniform way. It's just not the case. I think it would serve us well. When I've heard so many people speak of Trump supporters as all white nationalists. Again, I suspect that there's some out there, but that kind of characterization is just far too simplistic. And again, I'm not making a judgment for or against, just simply saying, like Black Lives Matter. I mean, I think what is so amazing and revealing is how many white people now are behind many of the issues that was for a movement that a lot of white folks until recently had not signed on to. So, yeah, this book that you've done, I think it reminds us all, as you pointed out, to think very carefully what are slogans, how effective are those slogans, and to never sort of essentialize people as being this or that. And I think your book does a nice job of that. John, go ahead.
One of the themes of the book that I tried to draw out was how anti-slavery folks who were very politically savvy, and Lincoln is one of these, recognized these deep divisions within what to them was the opposition party, and then they worked to inflame them. I mean, Lincoln very famously does this in the debates with Douglas, but you have folks doing it back in the 1840s as well, kind of forcing Democrats to hash out some of the issues on which they disagreed with each other. And so, that kind of, those are the folks that most historians tend to sympathize with, and I would just emphasize that they're figures in this book too, that they're not just watching right? Their opponents fall apart. They're actively
contributing to that. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Tell us real quickly, how were the Republicans, or Lincoln in particular, how were they, and I'm going to use the word reckless, right? Or how did they try to depict the other side in ways that sort of deranged people's understandings of what was really happening, right? How did they do that?
Well, I mean, one of the things that I think is interesting about Lincoln in particular is how his strategy shifts. Even during the debates with Douglas, he comes in and he expects to cast Douglas as this agent of the slave power who's responsible for the Kansas-Nebraska Act. But then he realizes pretty quickly that doing that will actually kind of potentially heal some of the breach within the Democratic Party. And so he starts forcing Douglas to talk about the potential free soil implications of popular sovereignty. He starts to say, are you really for building up the slave interest or breaking it down? He said Douglas was trying to pretend like he was doing both at the same time, but just sort of not allowing him to rely on slogans and to force him to say, okay, how do you think this is actually going to play out in places like Kansas? What's the outcome of all this going to be? And Douglas gets kind of caught there. And so, I mean, that would be a moment where I think I wouldn't say they're distorting things, but they're not allowing the opposition to sort of debate on its own terms.
We have a couple fans of the Lincoln-Douglas debate in the comment section, which is great because we never talk about this. It seems like around the anniversary we have, like, you see it on C-SPAN and then it goes away and we don't see it again for 20 years. But Richard Houston has a great question. How much did the Freeport Doctrine hurt Douglas among Southerners, Michael? And give a quick overview of what Freeport Doctrine is, because even I have to look that up to remember what that is.
So it refers to a statement that Douglas made during the debate at Freeport, Illinois, where he basically says that any territorial government could simply refuse to pass laws protecting slaveholders' property rights, and that would, without formally banning slavery, but depriving it of the legal apparatus that upheld slavery would be enough to keep slavery out of a territory. Now, for a long time, historians said this absolutely demolished Douglas's standing with the South. Then you have another kind of reinterpretation which suggests Douglas had already said this before. It's not new in 1858, so maybe it wasn't that decisive. But there's pretty clear evidence, and I mentioned this in the book, that they do remember Freeport going into the 1860 presidential nomination, and that really dramatic breakup of the party at their convention in Charleston, South Carolina. And there's a great account of a couple of delegates from Mississippi, actually, from Davis's state, who go in carrying copies of the Lincoln-Douglas debates with the Freeport Doctrine in there, and they say they're gonna destroy him with it. So I think in the Freeport statement coming on the heels of Douglas's stand against admitting Kansas as a state under the Lecompton Constitution, those two things together do really undermine much of Douglas's support within the South. It never goes away entirely, but if you look at the vote tallies, his support in the slave states is pretty weak. He gets something like 88% of his popular vote strength in the North.
Mm. Wow.
Do you have any other questions?
Not right now, Pete. You can go ahead if you have one.
I will press ahead here. Then, so I'm still sort of grappling with Jefferson Davis's views, because you said, these two issues that historians haven't fully appreciated, and that is, you said property rights and this issue of, it's about majority rule, correct? Mm-hmm. So what I'm trying to figure out here is, can you help us understand how the slaveholder defense, which obviously is about There's the property, the right to own African Americans. It's the right to take that property that they own, chattel, and to take it into territory that they think that they have a right to. And then this issue of majority rule, what I guess I'm trying to sort of stumble toward, and I hope you can clarify it for me and for everybody else, is I'm trying to get beyond what you're suggesting, that to reduce this just to race is not even close to being satisfactory to understanding the complexity of their worldview. How does this reservations that Davis has against majority rule and this commitment to property rights, how does that fit within a broader ideology that he and other slaveholders shared?
Right. So, I mean, his fundamental argument is that if slaves are property under the law, then a slaveholder ought to be able to take that property into any territory belonging to the United States and receive protection ultimately from the federal government for the enjoyment of that property. So that might mean the ability to turn to the court system to recover a fugitive, or to command a slave patrol, right, or any of the other kind of legal apparatus that's there to make slavery work. That it's already present in slave states, and he wants to extend this into territories. And where Douglas criticizes that is he says, well, that you're offering much more protection to a slaveholder than to the owner of any other kind of property. And Davis actually just flatly says, yes, that's exactly what I'm doing. Because, I mean, enslaved humans as property are more difficult to maintain as property. And Davis says this on the floor of the Senate. He says this is a uniquely fragile system of property rights, and so we need unique protections as a result. So yes, I am asking for the federal government to go beyond what it does to the owner of a horse or a chair or any other kind of property, and I am demanding that in the territories. And Douglas says no, it has to be subject to local majority control to decide how much protection they're willing to give you. And I think what's important about this is in all the scholarship on slavery, there's this real emphasis on the master-slave relationship, right? This kind of one-on-one relationship. Mm-hmm. But slavery required the active support of a much larger community of free people to make it work, to recover fugitives, to put down insurrections, right? To help to police this whole institution required often the active participation of a larger community. Mm-hmm. And Davis is essentially arguing for the right of a slaveholder to force a territorial community to participate. And Douglas is saying, no, they have the right to say no to participating in that, to becoming, embedded in that if a local majority choose. Yeah. So that's where I see
that's a critical point, and Michael, I'll give you a little pushback here. I think your critical point is actually an outgrowth of the master-slave relationship, because at its very essence, the master-slave relationship denies human inequality. And what we often lose sight of is that denial of equality was a denial of equality amongst all white men. And so we see a deep distrust of democracy, and you've already pointed out that there is at least a willingness to see that men who own property, that they can be responsible and part of the electorate. But there's also a fair openness, which I think would be surprising to a lot of folks, in which, not all white men are created equal. And so that suspicion or fear of majority rule is exactly what you said. It's one, it could be potentially be obviously a threat to their power, to their ownership of slaves. And I think you point out that Stephen Douglas in 1860 had some support. I don't know if it was especially strong, but support amongst mechanics and others who were not landowners and would have probably no intention or desire to become some. So I think that what you've pointed out here again is how the ideology of the slaveholding class cannot just be reduced to race alone, although that certainly is the cement, and there is no denying that there's widespread agreement that African Americans, because of their skin color, are deserving of being enslaved. But there's something more at work here, and that is when you deny human equality in the master-slave relationship, you have to take that step. And I think Stephanie McCurry's book, I think her first book on South Carolina.
Oh, Pete's internet's getting screwy.
Yeah.
There we go. There you are.
What's Stephanie McCurry's first book again? Masters of Small Worlds?
Yeah.
Masters of Small Worlds. It's an outstanding book. And I think that, again, your findings fit into that. If we don't have a question from the audience, I'd like to give Michael one last question.
Go ahead.
So I found that this portrait of Douglas and Davis, you are what every good biographer should do, is that you are certainly critical. And at the same time, you situate these men within their worlds. You show that within their worlds, that there was a certain idealism that they both had, even though we might find their idealism to be reprehensible. But again, you recognize, as I think any good historian should recognize, that kind of moral chest beating doesn't really get us much of anywhere in terms of understanding of the past. And then you get to Douglas, and he fascinates me. You've changed my mind about Douglas, who's a guy that I just sort of wrote off as a political animal who only cared about satisfying his own ambitions. And he certainly was ambitious, there's no doubt about that. But my God, here's a guy who says, popular sovereignty, right? Let the people decide. That's a powerful message. That's going to resonate, right? And it did with a lot of Northern Democrats. But then you say, it's kind of hopelessly idealistic to the point of being truly dangerous when implemented in the territories. What did Douglas not see? He's a smart dude. What did he blow? What did he miss? Because we always say today, power to the people, let them decide what went wrong.
Yeah, I mean, this is a good question, and I am still not sure what happened with Douglas on this. I mean, he's famous for saying, okay, this issue of slavery expansion is too hot of an issue to deal with in Congress, right? So let's just kick it out to the territories and let them decide. And what happens? Well, in Kansas, they start murdering each other over the issue. And so why he thought an issue that Congress couldn't handle would necessarily be handled in a peaceful or logical way in the territories is difficult to understand. That is especially true because in his home state of Illinois, folks had been murdering each other over slavery while he lived there in the 1830s. He's not that far away when Elijah Lovejoy, the abolitionist editor, is killed in Alton, Illinois in 1837. Douglas is just up the road. So understanding that, I think, is tricky. What I think, if you look at Douglas and his views of popular sovereignty, he gets drawn into it over time, and it becomes a bigger and bigger and bigger part of his thinking. Initially, he embraces this really to help his party win, which they didn't, but to try to win the presidential election in 1848. So it's a kind of a pragmatic kind of response. This will help to patch things over. But then it becomes more and more ingrained in his thinking, and he digs in on it more and more until by 1859, he's writing articles saying that popular sovereignty is really what the American Revolution was all about, that it actually predates the Constitution and is really this sort of foundational principle of the whole country. And so in some sense, he gets sort of trapped by the idea, I think, and he just holds on to it with both hands and really decides, I'm going to rise or fall with this idea as mine.
You pointed out some things about the territories in terms of what the settlers, what they could do, who appointed the leaders. Could you go over that? Again, I can't believe I didn't know any of this. So what happens in the territories and how did it make popular sovereignty in terms of playing out in real time so much more difficult than what anyone could have imagined?
Well, what it does is it puts a big sort of target on the very first election to choose territorial legislators, because the assumption is once they create a kind of fundamental set of laws for a territory, the fate of slavery will be pretty well decided. at that point. And so in Kansas, that first territorial legislative election becomes notoriously fraudulent and at times violent. And so, I mean, that's really the disaster. I mean, you could point to Nebraska territory and say, it worked pretty well there, right? You don't see similar levels of violence and voter intimidation and all these kinds of things there. But certainly in Kansas, it sort of invites people to race to the territory, to try to prevent the opposition from voting, to vote illegally, to kill people when they're not going to vote the way that you want. So it raises the stakes at a very particular moment in the history of self-government in these territories, or particularly in Kansas. And with an issue like slavery, people have to be willing to lose, right, for democratic decision-making to work. And if they're not, then you're going to have problems.
And the settlers, and maybe this isn't an apt comparison, are they, in a sense, like the residents of the District of Columbia? I mean, they don't have, well, just tell us, what's their relationship to the federal government in terms of their voting rights and who they can vote for?
Yeah, this is something that's fascinating and I think has been underappreciated. So if you move to a territory, let's say you could vote in your home state, you move to a territory, you lose the ability to have voting representation in Congress. Territories have non-voting delegates to Congress, but they can speak, but they can't vote. And you lose the ability to participate in presidential elections too. And Douglas was keenly aware of that. And I see one aspect of his career is trying to be a kind of senatorial spokesman for the territories as a group, for the West, as he would understand it, because they don't have literal representation. And people write to him. They write to him from Minnesota territory, from Oregon territory, from Nebraska territory, and they say, I don't really have anybody else to turn to, but I think you are on our side, so will you, support this piece of legislation or speak on this issue? And he becomes a kind of unofficial spokesman. And I think that's really important. I mean, we think about, manifest destiny and spreading self-government across the continent and all these things, but yet if you move to Oregon territory in 1850, suddenly you are deprived of meaningful participation in federal politics.
I thought those were some really important insights in your book. I certainly had not thought or encountered that before as well. All right, Michael, my last question, and then we've so appreciated you being here. Someone says to you, you know what? America's never been more divided than we are today. What do you say to folks who have that observation, who make that observation? I think
if they read my book, they will see maybe some recognizable things, but also some sharper divisions. I think we certainly have, regionalism hasn't gone out of politics today, but I think in most states you see a pretty stark urban-rural divide, and that's a different kind of geographical division than what you see in the antebellum period, where the lines are pretty clear. Or becoming more clearly drawn in both a partisan and then a regional kind of division. And the population was also much younger then, and much more, I think, maybe more idealistic. There's a certain naivete to antebellum Americans sometimes that I think we've lost. And maybe that's a good thing. Jason Phillips has written some really good things about this, about their belief that the sort of violent moment will just sort of purge everything that's bad, and they'll just win, and then everything will be great. I'm not sure we have that kind of faith.
Michael, sometimes I think that Americans today still have that idealism, but it's an idealism that's not well grounded in an understanding of the nature of democracy. They sort of see our system as being a pure form of republicanism, and of course a short history on American history or on American politics, I think would remind us all that democracy is often in the gutter, but it does come out every once in a while. It gets itself clean, and it's a beautiful thing when that happens. But I think if we as a people had a more realistic expectation of what democracies can do, the rough and tumble nature of them, the partisanship, and as again you show so brilliantly in this book, right? Constituents matter. Right? These guys are responding to the people, right? And so I'm not one of those people who cheerlead, go out and vote. You know, I suspect that people already have that. I hope they have that impulse in them enough that they want to go out and read and think about these things in a serious way, because history tells us leaders respond to the people, for better or for worse. That's what. That's what. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Michael, again, it's so good to see you. A massive congratulations in your position at the University of Tennessee. I'm sorry we did not have time to talk about your editorship of the Andrew Jackson papers. I know you will thrive doing that as well. And again, it's a joy to have you on the show. I'm looking so forward to congratulating you in person. I don't know when that's going to be, but if it's at the Southern Historical Conference in the fall, I hope we'll be able to get a drink and celebrate, because it is a well-deserved position that you have. And again, thank you so much for coming tonight. Here's the book again, Arguing Until Doomsday.
And there's your 40% discount from UNC Press. It's also in the description, as well as a link. I pinned a link in the comment section to the book, and there's also a link in the description to the event. So you guys can't say you didn't see it. It's everywhere.
And this is, John, you can tell everyone, this is for Thursday.
This is for Thursday. Joseph P. Reedy, Illusions of Emancipation. He'll be with us on Thursday at 7 p.m. That's going to be a very interesting discussion. That was a fantastic book as well. So we're really looking forward to having him on Thursday evening.
Winner of the Bancroft Prize, I should add as well.
That's right.
Award.
Yes, indeed. So thank you, everyone, for tuning in with your comments. Thank you, Michael, again for joining us this evening. It really means a lot to us. Thank you, Pete, as always. Mm-hmm. And we will see you on Thursday evening at 7 o'clock with Joseph Reedy. Take care, everyone.
Thanks, Michael. Bye-bye.